Here are the most terrifying teen inmates that will be locked up forever. Number 10. Brian Lee Draper. Brian Draper spent most of his childhood in Utah before moving to Idaho for high school. While at Pocatello High School, he met Tori Adamczyk. Both boys became fast friends and had a fascination with films and recording and started making their own films together. While in grade 11 at Pocatello, they met Cassie Jo Stoddart, who was in a few of their classes. Tori and Brian were reportedly inspired by the Columbine Massacre and the movie Scream and began to plan a murder. They recorded themselves planning while at school who they would target and how. They heard that Cassie Jo Stoddart would be house-sitting for her aunt and uncle and decided that her vulnerability made her the perfect target. The night of the murder, Cassie was at the house with her boyfriend Matt Beckham. Brian and Tori, both 16, showed up to hang out with Cassie, and Cassie gave them a tour of the house. Soon after, they said they wanted to go see a movie, and so they left. Before they left, they unlocked the basement door so they could get back in quietly. They drove down the street before getting out and walking back to the house. They put on black costumes styled after the murderer from Scream and snuck into the basement. There, they waited for Matt to leave before they cut the power to the house and attacked Cassie. 5 days later, the teens were arrested and interrogated. Both claimed the other did it and convinced them to join in. During the trial, however, the footage of them planning the attack was shown, and both teens were sentenced to lifetime imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder. Number 9. Walter H. Bork Jr. Bork is now known as the longest-serving prisoner in New Hampshire. In December of 1955, he was sentenced to 99 years and 6 months in prison for the murder of a young girl. Bork had violated the girl, and then, when she threatened to tell her parents, he grabbed an axe and ended her life. This grisly murder was committed when he was just 17 years old enough to know what he was doing, but young enough to be sentenced as a minor. Bork then buried her in her parents' basement before going home and trying to forget the whole ordeal. Details around his arrest and trial are slim, but it's believed he was arrested in fairly short order. At his trial, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, but as he was a minor, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 18 years in prison. When his first parole period came up, he was denied on the grounds of the brutality of his crime. He was then transferred to a minimum security prison in 1977 for preparation to be released, but was accused of inappropriate interactions with minors. He also stole a check during this period and so was sentenced to more time in prison. In 1999, he was told he would be released upon the completion of an offender rehabilitation program, but he was never assessed for his ability to be rehabilitated and so was left in prison. He has stayed there since and has resigned himself to being institutionalized. He is now 85. Number 8. Kenneth Young. Kenneth Young had a difficult home life. His mother raised him alone and also had serious addiction issues. She would leave him sometimes for days or weeks at a time as she went on benders and binges. It was during these times when Kenneth, now 14, was approached by a 24-year-old substance dealer named Jacques Bethia. Jacques told Kenneth that he needed more people to help him with some robberies. Initially, Kenneth refused, but after both his life and his mother's life was threatened, he was forced to agree to be an accomplice. From the ages of 14 to 15, Kenneth participated in 3 armed robberies and 1 attempted one in the span of 30 days. Kenneth and his exploiter were arrested and tried for the crimes. Jacques, the adult substance dealer who had started it all, was sentenced to a single life sentence. Kenneth was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences. The minimum sentencing for a case such as Kenneth's would have been under 4.5 years. Kenneth is working his way through the appeals process for the 3rd time now, and though progress is slow, it seems he may be out someday. Jacques will be out in 2030, well before Kenneth will be. Number 7. Sammy Robinson. Sammy Robinson was arrested and charged with aggravated SA when he was 16. However, he was not told by police that he had a right to an attorney, and so his case was overturned. Sadly for Robinson, in the days he was in jail, he murdered another inmate and was promptly sentenced to life in prison for second-degree murder. Sammy is 86 now and has spent 70 years in prison. He is the longest-serving inmate at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Robinson did try to appeal his murder charge in 2018, however, his papers were filed late and so were discounted. Because of this, he has lost all rights to appeal unless he meets a very specific criteria for review. He has no more family on the outside, his parents have passed, and no friends from when he was 16 remember him or care to visit. He still wants his freedom, but he knows it will likely never come. He is currently filing a lawsuit against the state for poor standards of care and access to health care for the elderly in Louisiana State Penitentiary. Number 6. Warren Nutter. Warren Nutter was, until recently, the longest-serving inmate in Iowa and had served nearly 65 years in prison before his passing in 2021. Warren was a troubled youth and had had several run-ins with the law by the time he was 14. At 16, he was arrested along with 3 other teens in connection to a gas station robbery. While in the waiting room awaiting his interrogation, Nutter asked if he could use the restroom. He escaped the police station through a window before hooking around the parking lot and stealing a police-issued weapon from a car. He re-entered the police station and tried to get the other teens to escape while he threatened Officer Harold Pierce. When Pierce made a move to stop them, Nutter ended his life before going on the run. Nutter was captured 3.5 miles away and promptly arrested. At 18, he was sentenced to death, though eventually that sentence would be commuted to one of life in prison without parole. Nutter came down with a chronic illness in his last years, and despite numerous appeals and pleas, he was left in prison. On December 8, 2021, he passed due to his illness. He still holds the title of longest-serving Iowan inmate. Number 5. Henry Montgomery. Henry Montgomery was 17 years old when he ended the life of Officer Charles Hurt, a sheriff's deputy. In 1964, a jury found Montgomery guilty and sentenced him to death. 2 years later, his verdict was annulled as it was found he had not been given a fair trial due to racism and public prejudice. In October of that year, Montgomery, now 19, escaped from prison and went on the run. His attempt was unsuccessful and he was recaptured within 2 hours. 2.5 years later, Montgomery was again convicted by a jury of murder, which resulted in an automatic life sentence without parole. Since then, Montgomery was a model prisoner, serving as a coach on the boxing team, working in the silk screening program, and offering advice to younger prisoners. In 2016, Montgomery v. Louisiana was raised and passed, which states that any prisoner who would have gotten a lighter sentence due to Miller v. Alabama could be retroactively resentenced for a more constitutionally correct sentence, which affected some 2,300 inmates across America. Number 4. Patrick Nogueira. Patrick Nogueira was born to wealthy parents in Brazil and was bullied heavily as a child. First, he turned to violence before turning to drinking to deal with his anger. By 15, he was drinking a bottle a day, and by 18, he was vomiting blood from a stomach ulcer. At 17, he stabbed his teacher in Brazil for implying he was gay, and he served 48 days in youth detention and 6 months of mandated therapy. After his treatment, he moved to Europe on his father's money with the dream of being a professional footballer. He played for a season with England but was kicked from the team due to his drinking problem. Following that, he moved in with his aunt, uncle, niece, and nephew in Madrid, Spain. He hardly interacted with them and generally had a contentious relationship until the family moved to Piotr and he moved to a different section of Madrid. Nogueira's uncle threatened him with calling the police to deport him when his 3-month visa was up, and it's believed that this motivated Nogueira to commit the murders. At 19, Nogueira got on a bus with 2 pizzas and headed to his uncle's house. When he got there, he gave the pizzas to his aunt, niece, and nephew before ending their lives rapidly with a knife. He then waited for his uncle to come home before taking his life as well. Nogueira escaped back to Brazil before he was connected to the murder, but due to an international investigation, he decided to return to Spain for incarceration rather than be interred in the more brutal Brazilian prisons. Number 3. Alec Crater. Alec Crater suffered from severe anger issues from a young age, most likely connected to his parents' separation. When he was a child, he attempted to strangle his younger brother, but was stopped before he could do any damage. Crater shared a German class with Kevin Haynes, and the two soon became close buddies. Kevin's home life was quite good, and it's believed that this was the catalyst for Alec's violence. See, Alec just didn't like happy people. He resented them, and happy families were even worse. It's unknown how long he planned his attack, but it had at least been planned for a few days. Early in the morning of May 12, 2007, Crater snuck into the Haynes family home and took the lives of Kevin and both of his parents. The murders were violent, as Crater had to return to a few of his victims to finish them off, but then he escaped. Unbeknownst to him, Maggie Haynes, the older sister of Kevin, had returned home from college and was staying in the house. She was awoken by the smell of blood and managed to escape and tell a neighbor to call the police. However, police were seriously slow in responding, and Crater was able to escape. escape. He even attended the family's memorial service a week after the murders. It wasn't until he confessed to his father a month later that the police were able to catch and arrest him. Alec was sentenced to life without parole at the age of 16. He went through several appeals, however, almost a decade from his arrest, he took his own life in his cell. Number 2. Atina Marie Canaday. Atina Canaday had a very difficult life. She was born in 1965 to a heavily abusive father and was married by the age of 13. By 14, she was divorced and ran away from home. She made money by dancing and selling herself primarily, and it's likely she was mentally handicapped as well with an IQ of 71. In 1982, at the age of 16, Canaday met and fell in love with a married Air Force sergeant named Ronald Wojcik. Wojcik didn't know Canaday's age when they met, but when he found out and when the military found out about his infidelity, he ended the relationship. Canaday was heartbroken and bitter. Later that year, she met David Randolph Gray, a habitual offender, and Dawn Bouchard, a 15-year-old who hung out with Gray. The trio decided to, and planned to, kidnap Wojcik and either ransom him, rob him, or simply execute him. Wojcik and his girlfriend Sandra Soash were later kidnapped by the trio. Canaday suggested that Gray violate Sandra, and at one point while he was trying to, Sandra escaped and managed to call the police. The trio then decided they had to go on the run, and so Canaday ended Wojcik's life before they fled in the car. They were apprehended, and Canaday and Gray were sentenced to death, though retroactively Canaday was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 2 25-year sentences. Number 1. Elmer Wayne Henley. Henley was born in 1956 to an abusive father and a mother who tried her best to give her children the best education and life she could given the circumstances. Henley was a brilliant student, but following his parents' divorce, he was forced to take up a series of menial jobs to help his mother pay the bills. This caused his grades to drop off sharply. At 15, he dropped out of high school and would accrue a minor criminal record for possession of a lethal weapon and robbery in 2 separate years. While still in school, Henley met Dean Brooks, who introduced him to the older Dean Corll. Dean began to prepare Henley to be his accomplice. First, they went on a spree of burglaries, and at one point, Corll asked Henley if he would be willing to murder, to which Henley replied yes. Corll then offered Henley $200 for bringing a boy over. Corll was a mass murderer and deviant and had been responsible for the abductions and murders of numerous other young men in the area. Corll soon told Henley that he had murdered at least 5 of Henley's friends and stashed their bodies in a boat shed by the water. Henley nonetheless was involved in the kidnappings and murders of at least half a dozen boys before the fateful August 8th party. Under the pretense of hosting a party, Henley brought 19-year-old Timothy Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams to the house. Corll was incensed that Henley had brought a girl into his home and so drugged all 3 of them, including Henley. Henley later awoke while being handcuffed and managed to convince Corll to set him free before ending Corll's life in self-defense. Immediately after ending the life of the mass murderer who he had helped, Henley called the police and turned himself in. Henley was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year prison sentences and is still imprisoned.